Hello and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb Keith, and the Thinking Fellows is brought to you by the 1517 Podcast Network of shows. You can go to 1517.org/podcasts to see all of our shows. Today, I am joined by Bruce Hillman and Scott Keith. We are doing a sort of free-for-all set of topics today. This is an idea from Adam Francisco, who is not here.
He's not here.
So we have to steal his ideas, but not let him,
Participate in them.
Participate in them.
Yeah.
But we actually did this in our live show. Here we still stand in Bentonville, and the basic idea is, as we've been trying to, I don't want to call it panelly, but rotate through the hosts to give everybody space on just even our normal shows to work out their ideas on the topic. Why not just let everybody, for a couple of episodes here and there, pick their own topic, do the same thing, which is essentially, what are you thinking about right now? Any particular research that you've been doing, writing that you've been doing? Is there a book that's interested you? Maybe a question, a topic, maybe something else that's been happening that you're thinking about? Give us your pitch about it, and then the other people on the panel have opportunity to ask questions, respond. Maybe they've been thinking about it also, or working on a similar project, and we go from there. I like this format because it sort of gets to what some of our Q&A podcasts of old were like, especially in the early days of Thinking Fellows. We've slowly not done those, and part of it is every time I've tried to reopen those up, we just get the same 5 or 6 questions about baptism over and over again. Maybe one about the Lord's Supper here and there, and then more often than not, some of the other questions are better answered in email sometimes, just because they're like one particular doctrine or an interpretation of it that would require all listeners to have the same context or something like that. So I don't know. Seems like an apt replacement for letting us have a little bit of freedom to do some sporadic topics in here, and not let everybody have to talk about the same thing. So we will.
This is 2 times in a row with you, Dad, that you get to start.
Wow. All right. We never start with me.
We're going to give Bruce some thinking room here, and.
I think you're right. I did start last week too. Strange.
People are going to keep
a beating I gave him,
and it's going to turn out that you start a lot. Yeah. So, what are you thinking about, or what are you working on, or what are you reading? What is a topic that is fresh in your mind?
Oh, that's kind of funny because there's a big difference between what I've been thinking about and what I'm currently reading. They're like worlds apart. I've been thinking about the thing I'm always thinking about the last couple of years, which is sort of family issues and passing the faith down through the family and extended family, and importance of having kids and bringing them up in the faith and everything. In fact, I just finished a manuscript on my book. I'll go out to publisher to start the editing and magic process of making it a real book this week. So but what I've been reading after watching every James Bond movie in order, I've been reading every Ian Fleming James Bond novel in order.
I've never read those.
Are they last one?
Are they better than the movies like most books
are? I don't know what I'm going to do with my life after post James Bond. But in some ways I'd say yes. In some ways I'd say the movies are entertaining in that sort of movie sort of way that you want a movie to be entertaining, that the books sometimes aren't. So I was originally, I know Caleb didn't want this to be about James Bond. I was originally shocked at how closely the movies followed the books. And that's true up until a certain point. And then it's almost like, and then I know this now from, the world's greatest authority on such things, YouTube, that at some point they just started using titles and not the books. So a couple of them, they literally just are like, I like that title, and licensed the title and then wrote a screenplay that is at best tangentially connected to the storyline of the book, if at all. really. So
this is a free-for-all. He could talk about James Bond.
Theological or philosophical or worldview takeaway here.
It's funny.
You're right, Bruce, but
I just did Kelsey's podcast, Outside Yourselves, and we talked about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and very much from sort of like the hero's journey and Christ figures and everything, which that's pretty easy to do. Most of like the main characters in the MCU follow sort of one of those archetypal patterns, like almost to the T in a lot of ways. And I'd say, no, that's not the case with James Bond at all. Like that is not I don't know. I mean, Bruce should look into this. I don't know if this is like the first sort of popular level literary, or one of them sort of inroads of postmodern kind of like quasi-nihilism in Ian Fleming. But there's not a lot of there's almost no greater meaning to it, and you would not by any stretch of the imagination call him a hero. Now he sacrifices himself a lot for essentially patriotism, not even for people oftentimes, but for the idea of patriotism. I mean, he gets in the books. Let me just tell you, that boy gets wrecked. Like he gets wrecked in the books. Almost every book. It's like, no way, man, you're not still alive. Come on, or you didn't recover from that. 2 weeks in the hospital in 1960. I'm pretty sure that'd have been 3 years. But other than that, the funniest thing to me, I'll just say the funniest thing in James Bond. Ian Fleming died at 56 years old. Basically, I think it was lung cancer, and he had like a 70 to 80 cigarette a day habit.
Whoa.
Yeah. And he writes that struggle into the James Bond character. Like the James Bond character struggles with his smoking in every book and is always trying to get shy of 60 cigarettes a day. Like always. Like it's a continual thing for James Bond that he's trying to get like under 60 cigarettes a day, and after he's had like a really bad beat up and he's been in the hospital, he's trying to get under 40. And Ian Fleming will write in there like in James Bond.
So not a good thing for someone to read if they're trying to quit.
He's like, oh, I could just really use a cigarette right now.
Wow.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe it is, but he's also just like a raging alcoholic, and absolutely, and he knows it. Like anytime he's got a mission that's going to be strenuous, he tries to it's hilarious, for like 3 or 4 days, he'll try to cut down on the booze and the cigarettes, but he's constantly like, well, this glass of champagne with this beautiful woman obviously doesn't count. I can still have that. It's pretty funny. So pretty iconic. I mean, I told Kelsey in the Outside Ourselves that I love this kind of thing because even though I write, I have no ability to sort of create literary worlds. And I am in awe always of people that can. I am. And it almost doesn't matter. Like it sometimes doesn't even matter if I like the particular story, if the particular story resonates with me. You guys are like, wait a minute, you didn't like Tolkien.
Yeah.
You're both sitting here looking at me
the most famous example of like building a literary world.
Yeah. I appreciate his ability to do that. I believe I said that. His didn't hit with me. And they don't all hit with me, but I'm like Harry Potter doesn't hit with me, but I am in awe of her ability to do that. And I'd kind of say the same thing with this. So it's cool. I love James Bond movies. The book turned out well. You said we get questions on baptism all the time. I ended up writing about a half of a chapter on the importance of infant baptism. I'm pretty happy. It's like one of the things everything else in the book I knew I was going to do. That one Caleb kind of recommended after he looked through the table of contents that I had, and I'm very happy I did it. Didn't plan on doing it. Had never, like from a systematic point of view or dogmatic point of view, I've never written like a treatise on infant baptism type thing before, and I did, and I think it turned out really well and will be helpful to some people, and I'm pretty happy about that. So,
all right, cool.
Anybody have questions about James Bond or infant baptism?
I guess
I can answer your James Bond questions.
I do think it's interesting that one of the most notable and recognizable, media franchises of like probably all three of our lifetimes, really, right? It spans generations. Is like you said, doesn't have the sort of standard hero's journey or
Really?
sacrificial archetype or
Yeah.
whatever, and it kind of makes you wonder. Like it's definitely enjoyable media, but if it is a product of that, or if that kind of helps kick off in media this more just action for action's sake,
So there,
or just sort of the excitement of the cinema and the story that does lead us to a path of like movies without meaning.
I would bet you that there are uh, Ian Fleming connoisseurs out there that would argue with me on that, and I could set up the way in which most of the James Bond books do follow a sort of hero's journey, especially in the third act, where he always has to go through some sort of deep trial to overcome. One of the differences is that in a hero's journey, there's usually like a mentor or an ally or something like that, and there occasionally is in the Bond. It's oftentimes one of the quote unquote Bond girls that he has to sort of ally with to get out of the situation. But it's just not the same as like going through that trial to set as like a paramount sacrifice. Think of Tony Stark at the end of Endgame, and sacrifices his life and everybody's saved. It's kind of the same because oftentimes it's like stopping a nuclear bomb from going off or something like that. But it's just it doesn't have quite that same sort of like acknowledgement that that's what he's doing. I mean, many
Maybe there's
times
some
he's just
benefit.
going through the trial and he pretty much just thinks he's going to die, but it's like I might as well fight anyway.
Maybe there's some benefit to this in that I'm like getting more and more exhausted isn't the right word, but seeing that those heroes' journeys are less Christ-like and more like in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and other places are actually seemingly more an attempt at a depiction of what people call progressive sanctification. You take a kind of bad person, you give them some reasons to improve. They go on this hard journey where some external forces are helping them move along the way, but they're forming themselves into a better person. And then finally, that culminates in them being able to make the Christ-like sacrifice
So
and do
he
this.
he never forms himself into a better person. That is the overarching story arc.
Well, maybe
He
that's
doesn't. And
good. It's a little more
the one you
realistic.
guys have seen in the TV in the movies, his boss is always loves him and thinks he's one of his best agents, but is always kind of disappointed in James Bond's lack of personal progression in his life. Like he's always like, ugh, another girl, ugh, another cigarette. He's always kind of like that with him. And that is kind of interesting. What to get to the MCU, one of the things that's made modern, like post Endgame MCU movies so bad, is that they don't follow the hero's journey anymore at all. In fact, they just sort of have focused on these strong female characters, and because it's 2025, they're not allowed to write weaknesses or bad intent into female characters. And so the shift to moving to female characters wouldn't be bad necessarily if they would write them like real people, but like they did Tony Stark, where he's super flawed and he's flawed in every movie. Tony Stark, the biggest sort of I think Christian tie into Tony Stark is he's a saint sinner. Like through he lives his life continually in the stories. I know he's not real, as like this sinner saint, and James Bond's got that for sure. Much less saint, sort of. Again, his one redeeming quality for the most part is his duty to England. He's got most often no higher good going on other than he feels a sense of patriotism and duty towards his country, and that's kind of what he's got.
Melanchthon says, on Earth, outside of your duties to your family, there's no higher good than patriotism. And Homer teaches us this.
So. James Bond and Ian Fleming must have been reading a lot of Melanchthon and Homer then, because they got that going on in spades. They're really good. They're entertaining. If you're looking for just sort of like hey, I want something different. I've watched the movies. I kind of would like to see a little bit. You don't have to do like me and read all 15 novels, and 3 short stories, but you could.
All right. Well, Bruce,
Well, let
what
me
are
just say
you
something quick on Bond
thinking
first.
about
So
working
I don't know if you
on,
guys have seen,
reading? What
or if
what are
readers have
you?
seen,
However you want to go with this.
years ago, the Olympics were in London, and they did like an opening, probably what's considered the best opening to the Olympics ever. So they just make fun of everything. And they filmed Queen Elizabeth II,
Oh
the
yeah,
real Queen Elizabeth II, with James
yeah.
Bond in this quick little
With Daniel
short
Craig,
for the
right?
Olympics, which you can find on YouTube. It's very funny, with Daniel Craig, who was Bond at the time.
Yeah.
And she goes and helps him on a mission, and they have a stunt person jump her out of the helicopter to start the Olympics. It's really funny. But I heard her comment when she was asked about that. She didn't want to comment too much on it, but she just said something to the effect that she was very happy that she could finally be a Bond girl. So, so the fact that it has that type of reach, and that was what she
That's
told everybody
funny.
is, I got to
That
be a
is
Bond
so
girl.
funny.
So,
That is so funny. That's funny. It's interesting that Ken, Caleb, and I have argued about this a little bit. We don't need to do it here, but Daniel Craig, so you have um, Sean Connery, George Lazenby, Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton, and then Pierce Brosnan, right? Th- those are all essentially character from the books. They're all the same guy, like in the same universe and the same timeline, even though that doesn't sound like it would make any sense from 1961 until 2006 or whenever Pierce Brosnan's last movie was. They are. That's just how the production company structured it. Um, Daniel Craig is a different person in a sense. He is James Bond, but he's not like the next James Bond after Pierce Brosnan. He's kind of like the first James Bond in the new set of in the new Bond. His movies are interesting because Casino Royale is the first James Bond book, the first Daniel Craig movie. The first James Bond movie ever by Sean Connery was Doctor No, which is like I'd have to look, the 3rd or 4th book or something like that. That then has to sort of refer back to Casino Royale that maybe you read or you didn't in the 60s. And that first Daniel Craig movie, Casino Royale, it does a surprisingly faithful adaptation of a book that I think was written 1959 or 1960, and it's good. And because they were in that one adapting the way they did it to kind of match more the Bourne Identity style rather than the kind of goofy style of the previous movies, it matched the book very well because the James Bond books are, I mean, again, he gets wrecked in these books. Like he never just like gets to straighten his tie and move on. He gets wrecked in these books. We're talking like skin grafts, the whole 9 yards. And but then after that, within the James Bond, within the
You
Daniel
need a
Craig,
James Bond podcast.
well, so I'll be done. After that, after Casino Royale, they just go off the rails. They don't match any of the rest of the books to the movie, or movies to the books, except in the very last one. They kind of do the Poison Garden that's from Never Say Never Again.
yeah,
Or wait,
no
You
worries.
Only Live Twice.
It's all good.
So many titles.
I'll give you
All
a
right,
few
I'll stop.
things. You can
I'll stop.
decide what
Okay,
you want me to
Bruce.
talk about, I guess.
Okay, sorry, Bruce.
To answer your
I'm
question,
done.
though, Caleb. So, similar to Scott in a way. So, in the daytime, I read theology, but in the evening, I tend not to. I try to read something else. So, in it could be related to theology, though, but not theology proper. So, in the evenings, right now I'm in a book called Mao's Great Famine, which is a book on the Cultural Revolution, particularly the Great Leap Forward that Mao did and how he destroyed hundreds of millions of lives. And before that, I had just finished a book on Scientology. I also, yeah, yeah, me too. I was super interested in it for a long time.
Oh, really? That's
Yep.
a trip.
I'm
Scientology
currently
trips
just
me out,
starting a
man.
book
Although
also called the
I'm a big
Kojiki,
Tom
which is
Cruise
like
fan. Just throwing that out there.
some consider it one of the oldest books in the world. It's the kind of book of Japanese prehistory and mythology. It's one of their first, if not the first book that's complete that we kind of have. So, or do they? Oh, really? Oh, okay. That would be
Speaking
interesting.
of
Actually, that
Japan, the
would
James Bond
combine.
book
the
you should
British
read
and the
is he
Japanese
only lives twice.
culture thing
Set in
that I
Japan.
like. No,
Mm.
no.
Set
And
completely in Japan.
theologically, the two things that I'm kind of doing
Yeah.
research and working on right
All right.
now
Sorry. I'm
are
done. I'm done
the
now. For
Odyssey,
real. I'm done.
and the idea of God's silence and what that might mean for people and how the Bible talks about silence. And I think they're related in a way. Theodicy. Yeah, yeah. So
So you're
the question of evil
rereading the
in the
Odyssey
face of a good
as
No,
God.
part of that.
theodicy.
So right now I'm just
Oh,
sort of
I'm
in a
sorry.
listening phase
I
with
don't have my
that.
hearing
I
aids.
have my own sort of theory about what I eventually might want to say about that. But right now I'm trying to just get as much of the conversation and where it goes as I can. So that's what I'm kind of doing on my research side right now. So I don't know what any of those topics you want to delve into.
Well, the Mao one is kind of
Yeah,
interesting, Bruce,
that's one to hit me on
because
too.
there of I don't know, regime change is something people are always in global politics worried about, and right now, everybody's I think kind of worried about it because of all the global conflicts happen right now. That those could shift so dramatically with regime change or what the consequences of those might be, and also it seems
Yeah,
that that
what's
would tie
amazing
into your
about that
theodicy
whole
thing, since
time period in
the
China
regime
is,
change to
first
Mao
of all,
caused so
how
much
Mao
human
came to
suffering.
power, which was not, uh, he was not someone who, in some ways, was primed or was expected to get to the position that he got. It was a little bit of luck, a little bit, meaning he was in the right place at the right time. He certainly was a very talented individual, um, but he was very polarizing always. And so people within the Chinese Communist Party, interestingly, he started off as a very pro-democratic person in his younger years in college. He wanted to try to make China like the U.S. And was very pro-democracy and very pro-Adam Smith. And then, essentially, to make the narrative as short as I can, the government in China at the time, which was somewhat U.S. backed, they did not treat the Chinese very well, and that started to leave a lot of people sour with the idea of democracy. And then he found Marx and started reading Marx. He truly was a bookworm, Mao. He was a highly intelligent intellectual, but like all these people who get concentrated power over time, he just completely believed in his own ethos. And when Stalin died, that was a big turning point for him. He really thought he was the leader of the whole communist world. He thought Khrushchev and everything going on in the communist world was just failing, and that he was not. And he was somewhat right about that, actually, when we look at things. Anyway, the context of the famine, what started all that is China's a poor country. It's been abused by Japan. It's been abused by opium wars and all these other kind of things for centuries, even though they had been, great empire back in the Middle Ages. And people are peasants, and there's no infrastructure. There's none of this stuff. So Mao, when the communists finally come to power, they know they have to do two things. They have to get the economy going, and they know that in order to do that, they need to get industry going. There's no infrastructure. So essentially, Mao has a two-part way of doing this, and he calls it the Great Leap Forward, which is essentially this master plan to accelerate production as fast as you possibly can. And he thinks that in 5 to 8 years, China, which has nothing, can catch up to the UK and surpass it in its industry. UK's number like 2 or 3 in the world at this time, the US being number 1. And this gets the Chinese people are like 150% behind this. They want to move forward. They are ready to do the work. They're ready to make the sacrifices. So he starts putting people into communes. He steals their property. He basically says there's no more property. And he takes all these farmers and villagers and he puts them on communes that are run by the state. And he says, we're going to feed you, and you're going to work on these collective farms. And so this process begins. It's successful in some areas. It's not successful in others. And essentially what begins to happen is Mao keeps changing his mind on what he wants. So he'll say stuff like, well, we need more steel. We can't get stuff done without steel. So he'll tell these farmers on the communes who are farming, and that's really what they know how to do because they're peasants. They can't read, they can't write, but they can farm. He now tells them they have to make steel, and they got to make it in furnaces that they build on the communes, like in their backyards. And so they start smelting all this steel, and it causes like the whole area to get black, and people get sick. And the steel's bad; it's no good. It can't be used for anything because they don't really know what they're doing. And then because they're working on the steel, they are not working on the farms, and so they start to have food shortages. Not only that, everyone had lied to Mao. Literally, everyone had lied to Mao about how productive the farms were because they were afraid if they gave him low numbers that they would be removed and someone else would be put in. And this happened all the way down the chain from Mao all the way down. So the Chinese guy who's like on the ground living in the commune who's in charge, he's lying to his superior's lying. And the numbers keep getting inflated all the way up. And this is happening on a mass scale all over China. So Mao actually starts to sell food to other countries because he thinks there's these surpluses of rice. Yeah. So they sell food because they think they have these huge
I mean, I
surpluses
don't mean to
coming in.
laugh, my
But they
lord,
don't.
what a cavalcade of errors.
And so the steel's no good. They can't sell the steel. The food,
Because the numbers are fake. Yeah.
starve. And then Mao decides, well, part of this problem is caused by sparrows because the sparrows are eating the new crops and they can't grow. So he orders the death of all sparrows. And Chinese women will stand outside all day, all throughout China. Just imagine this with pots and pans, banging them so that the sparrows won't land on the ground. And there's pictures, you can YouTube it, of the government gave money for any sparrow you killed. People have like wheelbarrows and wagons and things, hundreds of sparrows that they're carrying in. There's only one problem with this, though. The sparrows eat the insects that cause blight on food. So they literally kill every sparrow in China. They don't let them land. Sparrows don't like loud noises. So they're banging everywhere throughout China all day long. The sparrows get so exhausted from flying that they just die. They just drop out of the air and die. And they die at a massive, they almost go extinct in China. And then the insects take over and there's no food left. It just destroys the entire food. It eventually lead to a period where Mao loses power and Deng Xiaoping, who becomes the later president of China, he takes over, and Mao's kind of put in the background. But then he makes a return later during the Cultural Revolution by causing students in universities to rise up as his private army and basically destroy everything. So anyway, that's the quick version of it. But
yeah. Boy, I wonder if we could ever see anything like that in America.
Why do communists do so well with students all over the globe?
Because
that's a good point.
Young people.
Yeah.
One, they're malleable and they don't have anything. I mean, in our country, it's because they don't have money, they don't have power, they don't have influence. And you tell somebody who's young, who's full of energy and vigor and whatever else, and you say, you know what, you don't have any of this, and they do, and it's wrong. I'm going to equalize the playing field. And it's very attractive. And I mean, give them 15 years and they have some of that stuff, and they realize that the playing field usually gets equalized.
What I found really interesting about Mao, and found it both fascinating and give him props for being highly astute at it, but also very disturbing. No, there's a context here, Caleb.
What I found interesting about Mao
is that Mao was very savvy in that he almost never gave direct orders. He would say, I like this, or someone would say something like,
it'd be nice if that
answer. And what people would do is they had to, essentially everyone around him had to read his mind. If you didn't act on something the way he wanted, then he would remove you. But if you did act on it and you did well, he would reward you. But if you acted on it and it didn't go well, he would say, I never told you to do that. Why'd you do that? You're an idiot. And you would be the scapegoat. So he was able to maintain his power by using these very generic but contextually kind of like, it's sort of like when the mafia back in the 80s, you know, when the FBI was looking at the mafia in New York, and they would say, like, they're going to whack a guy. And now we know that means kill them. But back then, that was code language that people, you know, the FBI had to figure that out. So when they went to court, they could say, no, this is actually what they mean when they said that. Mao did all that kind of stuff too, where people didn't really know what he meant, but they kind of knew what he meant. And basically everyone always around Mao his entire life rose to power and was killed or cut out, except for one guy named Zhou Enlai, who was the premier of China, who Nixon met. He was just a master at reading Mao. He knew Mao's thoughts, and he was always able to survive. And in China today, Mao's a conflicted character. they recognize without Mao they wouldn't be where they are, but they also recognize Mao killed most of them. So he's a controversial figure in China, but Zhou Enlai is not. He's their true hero in China. Is the guy who survived Mao and who they think saved their a lot of people. So
Wow, interesting.
it's
I
really
know
interesting
so
to
little
that
about
period,
China. This is
particularly
all
like
very
the
interesting to me. Caleb,
50s
maybe
to
I'll
the
replace World
70s
War
is
II
such a
knowledge with China
crazy
knowledge.
period
Yeah,
in
maybe you
Chinese
should.
history. I will recommend, if you're interested, there is a great podcast called the China History Podcast, which is done by an American guy who has done business in China for years, and I kind of retired and just does Chinese history. But his stuff on the Cultural Revolution and Mao is really entertaining if you're just bored and want something to listen to. He tells it like a story. He's a good storyteller. He sometimes has guests, but usually it's just him. His name's Laszlo Montgomery. That's a good resource if you're interested and don't want to sit down and read a whole book. Yeah, that's true too. But
Or if you're sick of listening to politics. All right, Caleb, what have you been thinking about, Caleb? There
Dude,
you go.
so much stuff, so many things. Well, I guess I mean you guys both sort of did what you were reading, and I have read a couple of books. So let me make sure I get the name of the second one right. But I read um, over time the book called Generations by Twangy, which is basically she put together a bunch of the research she had done for previous books like iGen, which I think was
yeah,
about millennials, or was that one about Z? And then
Yeah, Generation Me is the millennial
so
one.
Generation Me about millennials, and then iGen was about Generation Z. She then did more of a comprehensive overview, starting with. She really started with the silent generation, so she mostly wanted to give us the generations that are still living and influencing culture today. So she started with silence, of whom there are still many in American politics. Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi being kind of
I
famous
mean, they
examples.
are, but it's like you got to think of like the really old politicians.
Yeah, like the really old ones. The ones who stay because who would replace them is so contested or is endangers some sort of party unity or something like that for the most part, and so they're still sort of present or active because of that is mostly what you get the impression of. But she does a characterization of that, and it's a very good book, but it's a little depressing in the sense that things that you would say are steps backwards for our society or generational issues or problems in particular generations. I would say the book gives you the impression that it's mostly out of everybody's hands what happens with that, which is probably true, and that those problems are a snowball of technology and advancement and just sort of that you can't really slow down the technology once it's available and free. And technology can mean all sorts of things. So technology can mean medical advances. So like there's societal changes by the mass availability of birth control, for instance. How are you going to undo that if there are negative consequences alongside of that? As an individual, you probably aren't. You might make decisions for you and your family, but just the generational side effects of that on society, there's almost nothing. Just you and your church, or you and your family opting out is probably going to slow down. So there's stuff like that in there, but it also kind of gives you hope in the sense that you can see that some of these trends are just not sustainable. So like the birth rate decline, for instance, as it's gone up, and it's gone up dramatically more in the last generation. It just seems like that'll hit a ceiling in for various technological reasons, and maybe that's too hopeful. But so I've been reading that and been just thinking about
The
the
ceiling, as in the decline, is going to level out.
yeah the decline is going to level out, or that or that some sort of technology will make it so that you could do this. So, okay, so here's the biggest takeaway for me that's really difficult, and I actually think it'd be worth everybody talking about. If you look at most of the consequences of generational change, I'm not going to call them good or bad. I'll just say the consequences of generational change. In my generation, millennials, and I'm right on the bubble. I'm right on that year or two that changes over to Gen Z. So millennials and Gen Z, almost every consequence or major shift can be attributed to women. And people are not really ready to deal with the consequences of that. So I didn't call them negative consequences, but almost every single one has to do with changes in society for women, not changes in society for men. And I think the lack of attention to that explains some of the political divide we have, and people scratching their heads like, why is there such a political gap between men and women in the United States? Or why is there a growing religiosity gap where all of a sudden men lose their religion or stay in their religion at a more stable rate than women? That's never happened in recorded history before. Why is this happening? And people just sort of scratch their heads about it. But the data is all sort of right there. And I would say Twangy even sort of dodges this question a little bit while she'll read the data. So she had
Shocking.
a long excursus on finances of millennials, for instance, who one of the greatest news elements of our time is the financial disparity of millennials to previous generations. Well, on the whole, just money for money, household income to household costs, that is not true.
Even adjusted for inflation.
Even adjusted for inflation, millennials are doing better financially, even given inflation and higher cost of living as a household than Gen X did in the late 80s and in the 90s. But she shows that every single penny of that financial advantage or financial equality is in increase in earnings by women, and that not a single penny of that is an increase in earnings for men. So what are the possible consequences of that? Well, delayed childbearing in marriage, because this has to do with women essentially participating in the workforce in a full-time and educational life to the exact same degree that men have for a longer period of time, which means they're out of this sort of marriage market and child raising and childbearing market for a much longer period of time. And that even when they get married, they are such a great portion of household income that in order for them to reduce their time at all or risk an extended maternity leave or maybe even stay at home with children would be to put you in a severe financial disadvantage to the point where your household was severely magnitudes behind your parents or your grandparents financially. So that's one of them. College enrollment of women has surpassed men. We're right, like this year. Well,
Greatly surpassed
enrollment
men.
has for a while, but this year diplomas are passed now too. So that's contributing to this financial disparity. It's contributing to the political disparity. As fewer men go to college and enter trades, they tend to stay more conservative in their political views, and women, as more and more of them and the majority of them end up going to college, they end up more and more progressive in that. And so I just have been thinking about, how do you address something that is such a dividing line between gender or the sexes? Because if you talk about this,
can I add just a few more details, Caleb,
right?
before we answer your question?
The question you're asking
I published
is, how
an
do you
article
talk about something you're
with
not
us
allowed
with
to talk
1517
about?
a few weeks ago with some new studies out of the UK and the US. Barna had a huge one, but then there was a big one that was done in the UK a few weeks ago. And it's all along what you were saying. Women are outperforming men on almost every economic category in the two countries, in the US and the UK. I don't know about the rest of the world, but that's what the study showed. What was very interesting, and in the US, church attendance among young men, Generation Z, is significantly higher than women. Women are actually not showing up to church, even with families, and Generation Z, to be specifically, in a complete inverse of what we had seen when I was growing up, where it was the women who would come and bring the kids. Now the men are coming and bringing the kids, and the women aren't because they're tired, they've been working, they don't want to.
Yep.
So you're and single men, of course, are also significantly statistically higher to go to church now, and that's across all races in the UK and the US. So African American attendance in churches, white or black, is significantly up for men, not for women. So it's a really interesting phenomena. They didn't. None of the studies went into their. It was data crunching, so they weren't really looking for whys. It wasn't that kind of study where they were trying to say, "Oh, this is why it's happening." But one might guess that one of the reasons would be that traditional masculinity, or at least a clear and transparent view of what masculinity is available still in church settings, and that men find community and bonding there in ways where they haven't traditionally in the past because it was women and children
Churches.
who were singles in church. Now it's more men that are showing up single or with a kid in church.
Can I say too? So my topic last year for Here We Still Stand was young men, the church, and the gospel, and I tried to talk about this and two, before this upspike in the last 5-10 years, men were on a steady decline also. Just across the board, young people were on a steady decline, and now that shift is that women are essentially men are still up or slightly declined from the past, but women are off a cliff, essentially, just in the data. And there's also what's the author, but it's a book from the 90s, got republished during the Obama era, called The War on Boys.
Yeah.
That had to do with this. And if you kind of just look at the data, and I don't want to read into sociological factors, just the amount of energy spent on equalizing or attempting to equalize things between girls and boys starting in the youngest grades of school. I mean, starting in kindergarten and moving forward, that ended up in the data actually causing a mass disparity against boys. And then you see that carry into college, and sort of if you look at the degree differences too, women go get degrees in the more heavily ideological fields, and liberal arts skewed in those fields than in sort of hard sciences, engineering, mathematics, or research oriented fields. That disparity still exists, and you can see that that I just think that is a huge contributing factor to all of this. Like, the longer you are in college, the longer you put off family formation, the more your income becomes a part of your identity. Or I did all of this. My parents made sacrifices so I could have all these experiences in school, and then I could go to a 4-year degree. I can't give that up now for X, Y, and Z. Just puts you farther away from those older values, including church attendance, and maybe puts you at odds with some of the teachings from there. Again, the trap, I think, is it's difficult to talk about because what happens if you suggest that society might be advantaged by fewer women going to college? Well, you're going to sound like a misogynist who is just trying to put women back in the dark ages, who
Back in the kitchen.
who doesn't respect them, who doesn't think they should be educated. And when you aren't that person, but you do think there might be some benefits to and I'll just not say just women, but not everybody going to college, and maybe a case for that fewer women in particular should, or that we should change things about the education system to not try to close gaps between the natural interests of boys and girls, for instance, or the typical performance of boys and girls. That you end up sounding in today's society like a sociopath, even in conservative Christian contexts where people think that's where misogyny is still allowed. I can tell you it's absolutely not. And so you even attempting to ask questions or provide speculation like, well, what if fewer women went to college? You sound like a bad person. And so I think this would be a very difficult topic for people to talk about because, and like you said, Bruce, it's actually one the church is going to have to talk about, because the disparity between the attendance in this youngest sort of adult generation Gen Z is so big and growing, and it's not good for anybody too. By the way, that the relationships or the thoughts of Gen Z men and women are against each other all the time too, because you see that with the internet, that some of this intentionally, hey, men are going to church, women aren't, is then growing hatred or dislike of each other too, that they have such different worldviews and lives. That's not good for anybody. That's that's not good for secular society. It's not good for the church. And so we're going to have to allow some freedom to talk about this issue, which means that it will be speculating about certain things which are more or less beneficial for men and women to do in their personal lives and decisions, and maybe limiting or suggesting that people limit some of those decisions. And it would be dangerous, I think, or hard to talk about, because you might.
You know, you know what's interesting is just last week, like the end of last week, like Thursday or Friday, three different news outlets ran three different stories. CNN was one, AP was another. I can't remember the third. All of them on the same topic, but written not. It wasn't just the same article regurgitated, and it was on how the Democratic Party is losing in massive numbers young men, and that they're becoming conservative. Now, some of these articles were like they're becoming radicals. Others were more nuanced.
Yep.
But what I thought was really interesting was all three articles, the authors of those articles, all admitted that the left needs to back down from making masculinity itself the problem, because either they're radicalizing men to the right or they're just pushing men away. Now, that was shocking for me to actually read that they were saying this. The problem, though, is that if you are on the left and you hold to some of the values about women and equality and some of these a certain version of equality and things like that, I don't know how you fix that problem without having to change some of the ways you interact with. So, for example, one article had a really great solution, and it was kind of like, "Hey, we need to start telling men it's okay to be men, and that's not just it's not inherently toxic to have certain masculine traits." And I thought that's fantastic. But if you were in a more progressive school like I went to, I don't know how you could do that. And like I functionally just
Yeah, like what if a traditional trait of masculinity is providing, or or the desire to be the sole or the lead provider? That would be considered toxic, and I don't know how you, like you said, Bruce, how do you
so I think it's a
rewind
little bit
that?
about what you were saying earlier, Caleb.
Most of their
with,
peers are going to find
the author
that
you
as a
mentioned, who
problem.
I had read Generation Me, fantastic book, where she was kind of saying, in a way, my words, my summary, it's faded for now. Like this, we're dealing with an inertia, right? Like we're on a car, it ran a certain direction, and it's just moving, and we can't really just hit the brakes and stop it and put it in reverse yet. It's going too fast, and we just have to kind of go along for the ride. But what tends to happen, I think, well, one of two things in my analysis. Either you get some horrible world-changing event that changes values, and usually that event has to last a while to change values, like depression, a war, something that, or a pandemic that lasts longer than the terrible one we had to go through, something that really starts to change complete outlooks, because there's no other, what was working in the past doesn't work anymore. Or what you need people to just get sick and tired of the status quo, and enough so that the movement, the whole gravity just starts to shift. And that's how movements happen. And so they can happen back and forth. But I think she's right. No one can just light that. You can't light that fuse. That takes time. The only fuse thing is when you have some crisis that happens and changes things.
Yeah, I also think there's, like alongside the technological argument, like some of these advances or changes in society really are because of certain technologies that we're just not going to outlaw, right? And that would be the only, you're not going to mass convince people to stop using things that are convenient, that have become so normalized, or things like that. And so I kind of wonder, and I hope that there could be a positive technological shift as well. So, for instance, seemingly online education has fallen out of favor, and I understand all the reasons for why it's not as effective as in-person institutions. But it seems to me that some of our issues with younger generations, their workforce, their economic prosperity, their delayed marriage and childbearing, could be solved if we could find a way to do vocational training in a quicker period of time than college, or if there was some overlap initially with like the last 2 years of high school into this. If you could advance people 2 years faster on their way to a career or earning or being done with terminal, sort of what is for most people terminal education, that would be phenomenal, especially if too like there was a way to do vocational training specifically targeting women that got them into some sort of workforce faster that didn't have to be a liberal arts degree per se, that was still education. I
One
think
of the things you struggle with in that area is that, I mean, study after study shows that that's still their interest,
yeah.
is liberal arts, and people pursue their
Yeah.
interests, and so that I I don't know. I've been thinking about this a lot, for a while now, and the reality that I've kind of come to is that I don't think you're going to make a massive societal change in this regard. So within particular Christian communities, I think you can sort of start raising specifically boys not to give up. And I think that's mostly what, if you look at, there's lots of stuff. And I think the technology you're talking about is probably birth control and abortions and IVF and all this kind of stuff related to pregnancy, right? And your ability to delay pregnancy or mitigate the repercussions of a pregnancy that wasn't timed how you wanted it to be timed. I
I'd
used
even
to
add
call
social
it
media into that
unwanted.
because it seems to have
Yeah,
affected sexuality so much.
yeah. But the big thing that's happened is that all of that, in a sense, has been around for a while. Maybe save the IVF, has been around for a while, long time, almost half a century in a lot of ways. It didn't change things. It did change things, and sort of that's how sort of progressive changes happen. That's why they call it progressivism. It happens progressively, right? It's not always an over. We're seeing an advance in that overnight. But the big thing that changed in my lifetime was just this sort of telling boys that their contribution was not needed, and eventually they said, okay. And my one of my biggest fears, I don't know, fears isn't right, apprehensions to that, has always been that eventually you're going to get a generation, I think, of those boys that say, essentially says, up yours. I'm taking it back. And it's not going to be the kind of taking back that you want to see or that anybody really wants to see at some point. But that's what happens after a while when you sort of just tell half of the human population that their contribution is not necessary. They might take it for a while, but eventually they're going to get upset and they're going to say, this is BS. Now, I think that's going to happen at some point. You can see, I mean, Bruce's article is, in a sense, some sort of way of looking at that that's happening a little bit. I mean, they're coming to these quote unquote uh, historic institutions like church, and they're saying, okay, I'm going to exert myself here because here they don't tell me that I can't be me. Um, and I don't know how you win back like liberal arts institutions. Um, the people that have been fighting this war on boys, have been fighting it there for a long time. You also, the population, and I say this all the time, and people either believe me or they don't. The population decline is real. It's coming. It's the most significant thing that's happening that nobody talks about. Um, it's if you want to talk about sort of eschatological, it's culturally, you just can't sustain, even just on the societal side, you can't sustain a society without population replacement.
Can I
You just
can I
can't.
give a funny anecdote on this? I saw it was like a complaint forum for teachers, and
Yeah.
it was teachers complaining that the only locations where new schools are opening and not closing, and where there are ample teaching jobs, are in conservative Christian areas of the
Yeah,
country, because that's the only place that there are
having kids.
kids. And so they were
Yeah,
even noticing it there. So somebody
yeah.
was like, I don't want to move to Iowa. I like teaching in California, but schools are closing in my neighborhoods and schools are opening there, you know?
And even immigration,
Yeah.
what you'll often hear is immigration's going to take no, because the immigrant communities start having their population rates go down
Hmm.
within a
Yeah.
generation, and so it's not sustainable. They're going down. Population rates are going down in all of South America already. I mean, it's just, and the funny thing is that the only people that are having kids are conservative Christians, and you have to get pretty conservative Christian before that's a reality. Like you have to get in a sense, conservative religious communities. It's not just Christians, conservative religious communities, but you have to get pretty far down the rabbit hole of conservative Christian communities before you're breaking like even 1.4 to 1.6 replacement rate. And so in the the societal world, I don't think is going to be as easy in 30 years, because you need people to make this life ease that we have. But I do think it is going to be, the political landscape is going to change,
There's
just
a
because that's uh, you know
there,
It always.
other people aren't having kids.
there's a great book
There's
by
not a
a
built-in
theologian named
next
Miroslav
generation.
Volf. He's an
If there's
evangelical
no next
academic.
generation,
He used to teach at Yale. I don't know if he's retired or still there, but he's one of Yale's conservatives, if they have such a thing. But his fantastic book, it won a bunch of medals, maybe 10 years old now, is called Exclusion and Embrace. And the book basically looks at those two topics through scripture. What does the Bible say about excluding someone or something from, depart from me, I never knew you, to also embracing someone like I forgive you in your sins? And he tries to overlay these ideas held in tension. That's the view that he takes, that they're kind of held in tension. Over society. And one of the comments that he makes in one of the chapters is that when liberal arts decided to address the genuine problem of, say, oppression and inequality among certain groups of minorities, they took that template of oppressor oppressed, though, and they ran too far with it. This is what Wolf is saying. And he is saying that his quote there is it's battle gear. So when you start to talk, he says it's not a dinner dress or a pinstripe suit where you sit down and you try to work out your problems in a sort of civilized way. When you use the oppressor oppressed schema, you're putting on battle gear, and so you're going to war. And there's a time for that, he says, because there's a time and a place for everything. The problem is that the academy has developed it as its only way of doing business. And therefore, Wolf says, the problem is that people vie for, and this isn't going to surprise anybody, right? They vie for the greatest oppressed minority status that they can have, because that gives you the best battle gear. That's how you can win the war and get all the resources, is if you can say my minority and my group is more. What it leads to, though, actually, Wolf argues, is more exclusion. So even within the community that begins as an embracing community, that embracing community, when it only knows how to relate to itself under the oppressed schema, starts to break down into just an exclude. Yeah. Now, he argues you can't get rid of the term oppressor oppressed because some people really are oppressed. That's
you
the
have to
mistake he thinks on the right, is they just want to get rid of the language completely. His point is that only the Bible and only Christ offers a sort of held in tension response to this, where you can sort of admit, on the one hand, I have been oppressed, I am a victim, but not claim the identity of victim in such a way where you put on battle gear to destroy your oppressor. And exactly. But
you
what
might want to
I've noticed this,
do
like
like
look at
Christ
J.K.
and
Rowling,
take off
right?
the battle
She's a
gear
feminist, an
and
avowed feminist, public
crucified.
feminist, and yet she's
Tell Peter
being
to put
eaten
that
up
sword away.
by people because she believes that the trans argument, and particularly trans athletes competing in women's sports, is an affront to feminism. I think she has a good point there myself. And so you have to keep in the liberal arts. How does it end in the liberal arts? I don't know how it ends, but I just know it'll eat itself. And at some point, it's going to get so crazy where some deviant group or sexual group or terrorist
Sure.
group is going to start to be the one that we feel bad for and have to uphold, that it will just be dead because people will just go, no, that's too far. We haven't gotten to the point where it's too far yet, but we're getting there. You can start to see it with some of the trans stuff. But that's actually kind of light, right? Like where you think about, well, what are people going to go to pedophiles? Are they going to go to bestiality? Are they going to like what depraved things are they going to get down to? And then people will finally go, no, even this is too much for me.
What depraved thing is going to next?
That's when it'll end, and until it gets there, it won't end. I know. I am continually surprised too what people do.
I pray you're right. In
embrace.
a sense, I pray you're right. In a sense, I'm like, oh my Lord. Yeah, the next thing that we accept, the last couple things we've accepted as, I mean, not we've societally.
Well, people don't. Here's the thing I think too. One last comment, if I can. People don't. I think
it's like,
my view, anecdotal. I think a lot of people don't actually accept a lot of these things that are out there in liberal, progressive land. They're just afraid of the consequences because there are real consequences at work, in your job security, online, if you speak out. And so I think a lot of people's hearts and minds are not quite as progressive as they let off to be, but they just can't. If they're not in the right job or the right community, it's very consequential for them if they speak up and are perceived. Yeah. Yep.
It's also one more way social media has just not been helpful for anything.
Yeah,
we covered Bond, Mao,
I'll just
and
close this out
and
because we went long, but that's okay. But just saying, like, it sounds like with a lot of this too, both with Mao and actually with this, one of the big theological takeaways is that like desiring your neighbor's possessions and doing whatever you can to get them is at the root of sort of all of this inequality thing. And so, we've got the 9th and 10th commandments here at play. And
that's also the root of most Bond villains.
Oh,
evil
good.
too.
It's the root of most Bond villains too. So this was really actually a coveting episode, and maybe that one of the lessons here, even for Christians, as we like covet bigger churches than ours or the past, what the past had, is that you are owed nothing, right? Like you are not owed a white picket fence in a house. You're not owed a church full of people. Everything you have is a gift from God, and you're not owed more than you've been given. And so to then view everybody else in this covetous way is a very dangerous road to lead down.
That's a good one, Caleb. That's
society, for the church. So I think that would be my overarching, if I can force an overarching takeaway from this episode.
Good job, Caleb.
All right. Well, thank you guys for listening to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the Thinking Fellows on YouTube. Like the video if you watched it on YouTube. And you can also subscribe in your favorite podcasting apps if you are an audio listener of this show. Like we've been running this show for 9 years. So we hope you enjoyed this. Go to 1517.org to find out more, and we will catch you next week. Bye.